ladies and gentlemen, welcome. This is not going to be a lunch, but a wonderful lecture. Welcome to the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, oiip, and as we like to say, the Austrian leading institute for international relations, and it is true. So we are happy to have an opportunity to host Charles Martin Shields for a lecture on refugee global south, Judith Kohlberger, our dear colleague who just recently joined us as affiliated researcher, and we are very proud to have Judith at our institute. She's going to moderate, and I just want to say that we are happy, Judith, to have you. This is the first official Judith event at the institute. We organized this event today together with the Austrian Academy of Sciences. Thank you so much for your cooperation, and I just hope this is going to be just a start into a bright series of cooperations with the Austrian Academy of Sciences and with all of you. So, welcome once again. I hand over to Judith, to Charles Martin Shields, and wish you an interesting lecture and an interesting early afternoon.
Thank you so much, Ritan. Thank you also for making it possible that we have this event today. So you already introduced me as a sort of newly affiliated researcher here, and I'm actually very, very grateful to both the oiip and the Austrian Academy of Sciences that it was possible to organize this lecture, I think on very short notice, and I'm really thrilled to have Charles here with us today. So we're going to have a lecture of about 30 minutes, we said, 30 to 40 minutes, and then we still have some time for discussion, for questions and so on. So we hope that this might also lead to further contacts and perhaps also synergies for further projects together. The idea is also really to provide a room for interaction and for connection. I think it's a very, very timely topic that Charles will talk about today. You, on one hand, probably all followed the recent discussions in Germany, but also at the European level about externalization and about connecting development and humanitarian aid to refugee policy, or should I say to migration and refugee prevention policy, that is. So a very timely topic. And of course, on the other hand, just because this is happening today, if I'm not mistaken, Title 42 will end in the United States. So this will also mean probably, as some experts say, a new influx of migrants and refugees from the global south to the United States. So again, we couldn't have picked a better time really for this, Charles. And I'm really thrilled to have you here. Let me briefly introduce you for those of you, few in the room who don't know you yet. So Dr. Charles Martin Shields is a senior researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability in Bonn, in Germany. And his research focuses on development and humanitarian aid, enforced displacement and refugee response. And he's mainly focusing his work on the role of digital technologies, he will also talk about this in his talk today, in the lives of refugees in Latin America, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. And something that is very, very impressive, I would say, because prior to becoming a renowned researcher, Charles served as an expert consultant and advisor to the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, UNHCR, the World Bank, and US Institute of Peace, among many other organizations. So we briefly had a talk before, and I said, you did some actual work before becoming an academic, so it's all the more impressive. And we are really thrilled to have you. So Charles, I would say, without further ado, the stage is yours. We're very much looking forward to your presentation and hoping for a fruitful and productive discussion afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you. A very kind introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. I'll just shift that and put my clock here. Yeah, so by way of introduction, a little bit about IDOS, the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. Sorry, we changed our name recently. We used to be Deutsches Institut für Entwicklungspolitik, went through a rebranding, and occasionally I still stumble over the new name. But a lot of what we do in my team, in the migration and forced displacement team, and broadly at IDOS, is linking kind of scientific research and policy advice. So as I go through this, it will kind of be a big arc, a big tent kind of talk, bringing together kind of the scientific work that our team has been doing, that I've been doing on this topic, kind of linking the politics, especially in the Global South, which is where our mandate to do our work is, back to some observations of dealing with politicians and dealing with the technical people who work at the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development and UNHCR. So they kind of bringing all that together to kind of discuss a bit the science and policy interface that goes on behind this topic. So to jump in, like I said, it's a kind of a big topic and a big lecture in the sense of what I'll be covering. So to give it some structure, I'll start us off just with some key theories of development and refugee settlement that permeate, I guess, north-south is a bit of a false dichotomy, but donor or northern policy making. So the theories that I often hear kind of fed back to me by my counterparts at the Federal Ministry, for example. So we can't cover everything, but kind of some core ones that fit into how the German government and donors think about durable solutions for refugees, and how countries in the Global South, partner countries, also think about these processes in response. And then to kind of ground that in the policy space, kind of talk about why do donors integrate these theories, and what are donors' interests in supporting domestic refugee policy in countries like Kenya, Colombia, and Malaysia, which are the ones I'll cover. But then also on the flip side, these countries have a lot of agency in how they deal with the German government or the EU or international organizations. In the research we've done and the kind of interactions I've observed, how do they go the other way? How do these countries set their agendas and their interests vis-a-vis donors as well? And then talk a bit about what it looks like in practice. So we have, from our work at IDOS, we have evidence from Colombia, Kenya, and Malaysia. In this case, for these case studies, I'll be speaking for myself, not my whole team, because we have a few strands of work that are done in these countries. But I think you can find a lot of similarities in what my colleagues do. And then kind of talk about kind of the dark side of what happens when development cooperation, I think, gets used as a proxy for the worst impulses on both sides. But also some examples from science that I think could put us on maybe a healthier and more rights-oriented path, and where development cooperation fits into that. So there's some good science, actually, on that. So I said I'd jump into a few theories. This is definitely not exhaustive. And the slide after the thank you, I have a few more sources if people are interested. But there are kind of three big theories that I've had to deal with working at IDOS vis-a-vis policy partners, but also in the field of refugee research with any kind of a focus on the Global South. The big question that often comes up is, does economic development make people come or go? Do people leave a country because it's poor, or do they leave a country when it becomes wealthier? And this is kind of the putative migration hump concept. And the gist of this really is, in countries that are very poor, people don't have the resources to leave. So basically you're stuck. And a lot of the way that development economists think about it is, do you have the money to undertake a journey, and the different components of it. Now once you move into the lower middle income and middle income range, the probability that economists talk about the probability that any individual will choose to move starts to go up significantly. And the curve gets quite steep until you reach about $8,500 per capita GDP. And after that, it starts to drop off again. So you get this kind of hump shape. That's a correlation. I think the big debate that economists like to have is, does higher income cause migration? and the causal argument is still open. It turns out a few colleagues and I wanted to see, as economic development impact asylum seeking. Do people cross a border to seek asylum? And it turns out there's also a hump shape. So the capacity and resources to move are really important in processes of migration and asylum seeking. The way we often get this phrased by the ministry or by politicians that ask the ministry for advice, the worst of it we got one time was, maybe we should stop doing economic development and then people won't move. And we had to write a quick memo back saying, that's not the case. No, it doesn't work that way. But this is something, especially for development ministries, that sticks in their minds because they think about economic growth and they think about mobility this way. The next is self-reliance. The concept of refugee self-reliance in practice kind of grounded in about 2005. I think that was the first year that UNHCR put out an actual self-reliance strategy, a global strategy. And the idea was to say, looking forward into the 21st century, encampment is not going to be the strategy. The policy orientation for hosting refugees in the global south is going to follow more what you see in North America and Europe, so people living in the cities they arrive in and integrating. And the shift in this case was to say, well, then these refugees who are arriving need to be able to access jobs, they need to be able to access banking systems, healthcare, education, and they need to be able to do this in a dignified way on their own terms. UNHCR cannot do this for them forever, otherwise they're never actually integrating into the country as a fully, as a resident with full rights. There's been a lot of research looking at kind of the art in the last 15 years of how this concept gets used in practice. And I think there's something to be said that dignity is important, and the dignity for people to be self-reliant is certainly important. What researchers have seen on the donor side is a tendency to say, well, if we stop funding the humanitarian safety net, people will then be self-reliant by default, which is certainly not what you would hope for. If you're thinking about dignity and access to rights, dressing up kind of defunding a humanitarian safety net as self-reliance is actually a very kind of cynical policy decision. So we have seen quite a bit of that in the research and kind of the way that donors think about self-reliance. Then the third, international relations realism in refugee politics. Before I worked on migration and displacement, I was a political scientist and kind of in the hybrid comparative politics international relations space, so this kind of spoke to me as I was jumping into this field. So how do states make decisions vis-a-vis other states with regard to setting domestic refugee policy? And I think for those who follow the EU-Turkey relationship, there's certainly a quid pro quo, either overtly or covertly, going on in terms of how they react to one another. But what I found really interesting, and I'll talk about it in the Colombia case, is the way that the Colombian government kind of set its agenda and its diplomatic and official messaging vis-a-vis the United States. So it's big partner in the hemisphere. We've seen kind of how this fits into to the way that countries in the global south set their own agendas, which I think is something we will find interesting. I'll jump through kind of perspectives from the donor side and the partner side quickly, just to kind of say why would donors want to fund refugee policy in the global south. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. I think there are a number of reasons, but what I've seen, particularly on the German side, when I started in 2017 in Bonn, our first project actually was called Fluchtursachen bekämpfen. That was how the ministry was imagining this. So stopping or managing drivers of displacement, Hilfe vor Ort is another term that comes up. I don't want to say that it always is a bad thing to think about using development cooperation tools to stop conflict, to prevent natural disasters or environmental degradation, to try to create the conditions for people to make the choice to stay. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. At the same time, there is this like, what if we use economic development to make people stay? I think it's a very fine line that the ministry for a long time goes back and forth on, I think depending on the political winds a little bit. The next thing is investing in infrastructure and capacity in countries hosting refugees as part of their support for durable solutions, so their support for refugee self-reliance. This is an area where development cooperation is actually important because you're supporting not just physical infrastructure, but also public services, schools, hospitals, public health systems. And this very much is the space where development cooperation ministries are better positioned to play a role than humanitarian agencies. Development agencies do have a longer term outlook, they have the technical skills, and there isn't, I think, kind of this development humanitarian nexus where a lot of humanitarian people would say, yeah, it's not our job to do this long term, we are here to deal with the emergency situation. So this is an area where development plays a role. And then supporting innovation in refugee response. I don't know if anyone has ever dealt with the development ministry, but innovation, digitalization, these are like cool words that especially the politicians like using because they're kind of Stichworte. I can't think of the English now, even though I'm an English native speaker. But you see this in thinking about urban planning and refugee response. So ways that you don't normally think of a camp, for example, or digitalization in refugee response. And I'll talk a bit about what we saw of that in Kenya in a second. But it goes the other way. We do see policy and political responses in partner countries. It's not just that donors set the agenda and partner countries go along with it. Countries in the global south are shrewd, they're super savvy. Very often the politicians and the public servants that I've worked with were trained in Europe and the United States, often through master's and PhD level. And they have a good sense of history, I've noticed over the years. For them, they want continued investment in wider institutions and infrastructure that also serves citizens' needs, because no one wants to lose the next election because everyone thought the refugees got everything. It's a very, that's a narrative that often comes up in discussions I have with politicians in places like Kenya and Colombia especially. So they do want the best for citizens, and there's some good research from the Center for Global Development that actually shows if development cooperation ministries do that, you get better social cohesion outcomes in host communities between refugees and hosts. So there is some good news. Some prestige comes into play. I'll talk a bit about that in Colombia. Hosting refugees can be a great way to pursue politics by another means. And then stronger negotiating position on other funding streams and aid packages. The Kenyans, when I was working in Kenya, did this, and I don't even know what they were negotiating for. They knew exactly what buttons to push with this. And the Colombians as well. So we'll see some of that as we come up. So to kind of concretize this, as I said, we have these case studies. And something we can kind of bring through the case studies as well at a meta level is how do donor-funded programs reflect kind of a Western or Northern normative perspective of the role of technocracy, the role of the individual. Like when we talk about self-reliance, embedded in that is I'm an individual in a space. There's a grounded assumption about who you are within a society there. And then how do partner countries in the global south observe these kind of norms and normative approaches and integrate these into their own responses? So they certainly do. We will see that now, starting in Colombia. So a lot of the work we've been doing has been kind of circling around the temporary protection status for displaced Venezuelans. So essentially the background was 2 presidencies ago, the Santos administration said, we've got 3 to 5 million Venezuelans who have come across the border, depending on how many you count as being in transit versus wanting to stay in Colombia. We can't just have 3 to 5 million people living in a legal gray zone in our country. That won't work. But we can't call them refugees because of a set of rules and responsibilities embedded in the Cartagena Agreement. So every Cartagena country basically said Venezuelans aren't refugees, they're displaced people or special status migrants, etc., etc. And they had to come up with a legal process. It was called the temporary protection status, which is basically just regularized status for all Venezuelans who came since 2016 with the work to write, the work to access public services, and an accelerated pathway to citizenship. It was actually the Duque government. There's a picture of Ivan Duque with the head of UNHCR. It was the Duque government that carried this over the line and actually started implementing it. And what was interesting was it was never popular in Colombia. It never got more than 50%. It never breached the 50% popularity mark in national polling. And to a degree, I think it could have cost Duque his last election. There's some debate about that. But what's interesting here is the way that Duque talked about it. He knew that USAID was going to fund the bulk of this, so the US government would be covering the costs. And the way he talked about it and the Colombian government talked about it drew heavily on political, historical narratives of internationalism in Colombia's post-colonial experience over the last 130 years. And the debt that they owed their Venezuelan brothers and sisters for having hosted before as well. So there was a lot of kind of political messaging that positioned Colombia to then pursue other interests with UNHCR and within the hemispheric region, knowing that they were also playing a game with USAID and dealing with a much bigger donor partner. So we'll shift gears a bit. In Kenya, a lot of what I've looked at is refugee innovation and digitalization. So there's this TEDx Kakuma camp that was, I think, it was cute, but I don't think it was super impactful. But you know, this idea of digitalization and innovation is very central when development agencies talk about innovation and technology broadly. And Kenya is always the case that everyone turns to. And in response, Kenya has started calling itself the Silicon Savannah. So there's interests in play here that go back and forth. Now, Kenya, in terms of innovation, is also a comprehensive refugee response framework country. So kind of innovation in international policy. UN Habitat is playing a big role in Turkana County in rethinking how you host refugees using urban planning principles instead of camp principles. So again, they're considering this innovation. And then at other times, especially in the digital space, the government of Kenya and Vodafone and other big tech firms are also playing a kind of a role of saying, how do we do better cash transfers? How do we provide mobile health services? So there's a lot of energy, and the Kenyan government is very good at positioning themselves to draw on that energy from donors, from international organizations. When you interview refugees themselves about what they need, often these ideas end up being tertiary, and because of regulations and policies that constrict what refugees can do with a mobile phone, for example, maybe it solves some problems, but then it creates others. In Malaysia, this is a third case, and I remember the ministry when I pitched doing work in Malaysia, they were just like, "What? Why? They don't deal with donors. They're a not quite high income, high upper income country. They're ASEAN. We don't really operate in ASEAN. I think GIZ has a few projects there, but for the most part, it's off of the German development cooperation community's radar." But I said, no, actually, it's really interesting because, unbeknownst to a lot of people, they host, in terms of registered and unregistered, probably about 250,000 refugees. They're not a signatory to the 51 or 67 conventions. They make a clear point about this. They say this would be an impingement on our sovereignty and our domestic decision making. And they kind of have done this thing of saying, we're going to have a policy of no policy. Also, if you go through all of their legal documents about immigration, refugee does not appear in there. So they actually have no refugee law. UNHCR is allowed to operate and provide services, and the government says, do it with donor money. We're not going to fund it. But what they do is very domestically oriented. So instead of responding to donors, they respond to the public. The public, for example, was very sensitive to the plight of Syrian refugees. And the Malaysian government pulled out all the stops to get the visas in order, process the asylum requests, get them on a Malaysian Airlines flight, and give them job status. Really rolled out the red carpet in response to public sentiment. I don't think the picture below about how they feel about the Rohingya leaves a lot to question. The government very much uses the Rohingya refugees as a signaling mechanism to the population, or to the their voting base to basically say, but we are in control. Domestically, we are in control of the situation, and people will not flout our immigration laws. During COVID, there was a lot of abuse directed at Rohingya. A lot of times it was Rohingyas who were arrested and put into immigration detention. You didn't hear about the Syrians experiencing that. So there was very much a domestic signaling process. And colleagues at UNHCR actually said, from government to government, these things can change quite a bit. When I was there, the government was actually quite friendly toward refugees, as much as any Malaysian government is. Right after I left, there was a change of government, and the interior minister was quoted in the national newspaper saying, there are no refugees in Malaysia, there are just illegal immigrants with UNHCR cards. And I thought, that does not leave much to the imagination about how this government feels about them. So we've kind of seen two sides of the coin. I want to kind of come back and say what we're seeing in global south countries, in domestic politics, is often reflections and refractions of what we see in domestic European or domestic American politics that shape development cooperation. So development cooperation kind of being this liminal space between the two worlds. One thing I've seen that I think is troubling is when I thought it was doom spirals. I was trying to think of kind of what happens when your whole goal is externalization and a technocratic counting process of who comes and who goes, especially when you're dealing with a country like Kenya that up until the early 2000s was a pretty brutal dictatorship. There is not a long history of human rights and participatory politics. Well, participatory politics is quite grounded in Kenya. But this is a country with a governing tradition that's pretty heavy-handed. What happens when they see, even if it's with a velvet glove, a very heavy-handed response from the European partners, you're going to mirror that. And you get this kind of back and forth, which ends up with policy becoming performative. So instead of self-reliance really being about dignity and rights, self-reliance kind of just becomes a way for donors to say, we're just not going to fund this anymore, and the refugees will then be self-reliant. And in response, global south partner countries become reasonably angry about this. So I've had discussions with colleagues in Kenya and Colombia, kind of off the record, basically saying, yeah, this is just burden dumping. If we don't play, they're going to defund everything, which leads to things like the Kenyan government a couple of years ago saying, we're just going to close Kakuma and Dadaab refugee camps, and all 500,000 of these people have to move on. Because they knew exactly what button to push, especially with EU donors, to say, we want something from you. And I actually never found out what that something was. It didn't actually have to do with refugees. And of course, this means refugees get the worst of it in both directions. You get the worst of externalization, and then you get the worst of kind of being mechanized as an individual by a country like Kenya. So that sounds kind of bleak. But I want to kind of bring us back to a positive note as we kind of start to move toward wrapping up. Like I said earlier, there is actually research on how you get the most out of this, how you can actually use development cooperation policy, development theory, to achieve better ends, to achieve dignified ends that support social cohesion, that push back against division when you're, say, a donor working in a global south country. And I think a lot of these lessons certainly feed back into European and North American contexts as well in terms of sociological and political thinking. It was Thomas Ginn, who's a researcher at the Center for Global Development, who wrote this paper on what happens when donors actually make sure a whole community that is hosting refugees gets access to the resources, not only to host refugees, but to develop further the community's capacities with an aim toward building social cohesion. So it's not refugees and hosts, it's refugees and hosts with a shared agenda in terms of community development. He did a set of field experiments, I think it was in Uganda and Tanzania, and he found, with the limitations of experiments, he found actually this works really well. When you get community buy-in not just to hosting refugees, but seeing hosting refugees as a community process, and refugees seeing their participation as a community process as well. I think to a certain degree, it's a little bit self-evident that that would be the outcome, but it never hurts to have an economist do a randomized control trial just to add an extra push. But that requires engaging with politics. At the end of the day, you're talking about redistributing public goods. That is an inherently political activity, and politics is something I think development cooperation people are a little bit allergic to, because they like to think in terms of numbers and counting. But bloodless technocracy often is not aligned with human rights and dignity. And I think there's a level of comfort that development cooperation people need to bring to the table with dealing with kind of the political questions and the feelings that go with reallocating and managing resources. And what it costs for a politician who's not in a development cooperation ministry to say, yeah, we're going to use German or Austrian or French public resources to do this overseas. I mean, that's not easy for a member of parliament necessarily, depending on where your voters live. And this feeds into thinking about the whole community. So as Thomas Ginn found out, you have to prevent these kind of resentments and maximize benefits. Not every politician is going to be an Ivan Duque who is willing to gamble on the fact that they won't win the next election. And even Duque kind of knew, he was going to land a nice position at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. after his presidency. Not every politician in every country has that level of comfort in the post-political life. So there are real things you have to deal with in terms of making sure that politicians know that their voters are also getting something out of this. It was something that we've heard in feedback, practically as well as scientifically. And then this is kind of a non-scientific observation, but I just see it watching kind of public administration processes. Development and immigration and asylum policy going together instead of just running in parallel. I find it kind of interesting in Germany to watch the development ministry, which is SPD-led, and the immigration and the interior ministry, which is SPD-led, quite literally be on different planets, even though the ministers are from the same party, which makes me think it's even harder when the two ministries are different parties as well. But it doesn't, the challenge is, if you're a development ministry funding jobs training programs in Ghana, for example, this is something we've seen, the interior ministry can't be saying, we're not going to give Ghanaians visas to do these jobs in an EU setting. To a degree, it sets up broken expectations on the side of the people doing the training, but also then you have to ask the question, what are you funding? And there's, I think, a lot of coordination that could be improved upon when we talk about development cooperation as a component, a reflexive component of immigration policy and vice versa. These things absolutely affect one another. They're not easy politics, but if you get them right, I think you can actually see quite a bit of improvement in the way that development policy can help shape kind of a global refugee politics that is dignified and rights oriented. I will stop there and offer a chance to the audience to give feedback. I think I kind of went fast over the case studies. So if people want to know more about them, we did a lot of work there that I couldn't cover in this and keep the narrative intact. So I just want to thank everyone for listening, and now I'm actually to the exciting part of hearing questions and feedback. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Charles. Wow, I think this was really, in the most positive sense, a tour de force through so many different areas where we see how development policy, humanitarian aid are being linked to, domestic immigration policies really, and all sort of the fallout that comes with it. And I think it's very timely because I do think that I expect actually, unfortunately, we're going to see more of this kind of connection happening in the future. Also, particularly important, I found this point you made towards the end, to actually engage with politics, because because otherwise we sort of leave this to this technocratic approach, and this shouldn't be what we are aiming for. It can only get tricky, as you said, once you have the ministries led by different parties actually, which might be even more in conflict. And there is certainly this really tricky relationship between matching development policy goals with the goals of immigration control, but at the same time now, even when it comes to immigration control, we do have maybe even a counter movement happening with, you know, demographic crisis and everything. So these, I think, are many sort of new trends coming in. Very timely talk. Thank you so much. And now I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions, discussion points, feedback, comments. So I'm going to open the floor for your questions. Yes, please.
So thank you very much, Professor, for your very rich presentation. I'm a former official of the Ministry, French Ministry of Interior and DOSE, and I work also, among other things, on the migration issue. So my first question is not related directly to the migration issue. It's about this new expression, very trendy, about global south. What does it mean? And then, because for me, okay, I understand what it is, but I'm not sure that the people who are concerned by this expression know what it is. Meaning by that if the people are the people in Africa, in South America, or anywhere else, are told that we are speaking about them as global south. For me, there is something wrong in this expression, because we are encapsulating everybody in the same envelope and then the global south. And for me, it is something wrong, intellectually speaking, and even ethically speaking. But okay, once again, I guess it comes from North America or something like this expression, as usual, and then, of course, we have to deal with it. So, but the second question is more, of course, in relation with your topic. In fact, what we are used to speak when we are dealing with the migration issue is about the balance between pulling factor and pushing factors. This is if we forget this, we can forget the issue as such. So, in my view, your idea to, of course, to provide donor aids and so to the countries where we are supposed to, there are some flows from migration flow coming from the global north, let's say. Of course, in your understanding, is it a pushing or pulling factor? Because for me, as again working on the law enforcement and so, I'm not totally sure that it's not a pushing factor, in fact. Because by providing this assistance, this aid, we put ourselves in a weak position. We admit that we fear that they are coming to us. And then for me also, ethically speaking, it's completely wrong. It's wrong, as simple as that. And then, of course, by providing this aid, whatever, we indirectly invite them to come to us, because it means that we have the means even to help them in their own countries, or in our own countries, of course, far more. So this is just some kind of general remarks, and if you want to comment, of course.
Yeah. The global south, global north thing, this is actually something at our institute that I think is an ongoing internal debate about categorizing kind of political, economic, regional distinctions. We've stepped away from saying developing and developed country, because a lot of the argumentation is every country is kind of developing. That was part of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it does have some problems with falling back on it. I tend to think of Global South as kind of political pathways in which recent colonial history has influenced the governing and political trajectory of the country. Certainly not perfect. And I have also engaged with colleagues in Africa, Latin America, who would say, yeah, it has its utility as a way of framing things, but it certainly has its limitations. So yeah, that's an ongoing kind of question about how you define geographies and economies, and an imperfect one. On the push-pull factors, and this was what I was hoping to drive out a little bit toward the end, this point of saying, yes, if you fund, say, a jobs training program, but then you set your domestic border control policies so that people who go through that can't come and work, what are you signaling? Like, are you doing something that will signal, we want to help you, but we want to help you out there? And what does that mean in terms of someone's perception? At the same time, too, if you're really not going to be issuing visas for a particular labor activity or work class, yeah, what is the ethic of providing that funding? And are you doing it in conjunction with investments in areas in that country that can absorb that capacity? I've found with colleagues in Ghana in particular, there's a lot of this kind of cooperation going on between Germany and Ghana. Ghanaian colleagues would say, if we see that the German government is providing this job training and they're investing in the tertiary spaces in Ghana, if the expectation isn't that people will come from Ghana to Germany, that's one thing. If you're just investing in the job training and having this like one little migration center, information center in Accra, but everyone who goes to the embassy to apply for a visa gets rejected, what are you doing with your own resources? And why would you engage in what is, yeah, in many ways an unethical process of signaling to people who have now built the skills and want to participate? So I would say there are push and pull factors involved, but I would say push and pull is a very, for economists, I find it's a very reduced form idea. And then when you unpack it, then you get into the ethics and the politics. And then it gets really hard when you have a development minister and an interior minister who look at the same policy with a very different normative perspective on what you expect to get out of it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Plus, I feel what is always so missing in this very reduced and simplified push-pull model is exactly the second pillar of the resources or the capabilities. So do people have the resources to put their abstract migration aspiration, which is sort of created by push and pull, into practice? And that's sort of the second level that's, I think, missing in this model very much, which is also why it can't account for actual migration decisions being taken. And I mean, I think you actually pointed out the key aspect of resources and actually making people mobile, which, I mean, I'm not at all a development expert, but I remember that initially in sort of the whole development aid debate, it was also about empowering people, enabling them, making them more mobile, because this is also an adaptation strategy. And I do think current discourses on climate migration are quite helpful here, because here migration, whether it's internal or external, is seen as a survival strategy, really. So to be able to adapt to the consequences of the climate crisis in the global south, of course. Thank you very much. Very, very key, really. I see another question in the audience.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Robert Stein, I used to work with the Austrian development agencies.
Yes, I should stop talking about something I'm not at all an expert in.
No, simply to mention
correct me.
From which angle I'm coming if I'm asking some questions. I think the concept of development aid, and you mentioned it, is already, let's say, not the most actual concept. We also, or Austrian development policy, is speaking about and heading or trying to head to a real development policy level. And development policy means that it has to be integrative. It has to come with global trade policy, global financial policy, and climate is a good, by the way, is a good example. which political level will be necessary if we speak about, for example, integrate development, immigration, asylum policy, because these issues cannot be dealt at the national level or at national development immigration policy level. This is always a little bit ridiculous concerning the measures coming out, and even more in a small country like Austria. I cannot see very much impact if conditionalities between migration and development measures are made. So the measures or also the solutions have to be developed at the global level, and there are concepts. Some propose, for example, a global public investment facility where the countries, even big or small countries, all countries, are, let's say, negotiating eye to eye, face to face, in a newly to be formed global governance system, or step by step has to be developed. So my question would be, how do you see the future?
Very easy answer.
Very
to
simple.
that. Very small question.
I can think of a few levels, and actually I think back to, make sure I go backwards instead of forwards. There it is. For whatever disagreements I might have with Ivan Duque, his wider politics, I think one way to kind of bring this kind of eye-level discussion into reality, I think part of it is on the donor side, actually recognizing what countries like Colombia not only bring to the table in a contemporary sense, but I think bringing in a historical perspective on development, not from an economic development perspective, but social, political, regional development. Because even, I would say I was relatively naive going into the work we did in Colombia, and then having a historian kind of in our team whose background was 130 years of Colombian political development, look at what we were doing in migration policy and development and saying, you shouldn't be surprised at all that a hard right president like Duque would support a very progressive approach to regional, to refugee integration or displaced people integration. As he said, if you look at the history, the myths that the Colombian political class tell itself, and the way that they have engaged hemispherically in developing the Organization for American States, and the way they positioned themselves at the 1951 convention, they knew what they were doing. But a lot of times when we talk about development cooperation, these kind of histories don't come into play, because it's like, you have your program, you have your log frame, your measurement strategy, and then you want to see your outcomes, kind of what happened with the project, maybe a three-year history. And I think, at least in development studies, we're kind of really re-engaging with people who do historical research, and bringing our questions to them. Because to have this guy, Robert, basically walk me through Colombian history, I was like, this makes total sense. And actually, they're already playing very eye to eye. But if you're not trained to know where to look for that, and in the development studies field, generally we're not. And as a political scientist, I'm trained to look at a very particular type of history. It's hard to have the debate. It's hard to start from how do we get from there to here, if you don't know that actually a lot of your partners are already here. And I found that really striking in the Colombia case, the degree to which the diplomatic history and the self-perception of Colombia itself has on how they deal with migration and displacement and how it positions them really punch above their weight in terms of shaping debates. And the fact that in the TPS example, Colombia really actually was the one who led the US along. And they were the ones who very quickly realized the United States doesn't want 5 million people passing through Central America and Mexico. Let's get ahead of this and actually shape the debate and shape the policy space so we get the money we need to do what we know we need to do, and also build on our 50 years of unfortunate experience being a leading country in managing internal displacement. But I think without having a deep, on the academic side, without a deep base in engaging these historical perspectives, I think sometimes it risks feeling like you're always at square one. Even if in many cases we're maybe farther along than on either side of the equation, we would be able to admit.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was very interesting. I did a lot of motivational research among migrants and refugees. We were talking about refugees. What we're talking about is in fact mixed migration. And especially I was looking at Western Africa, and if you talk to the people why they came, why they made the decision, who they are, it turns out they are aspiring middle class. They are people, and their main driver, the main motivator is there are no perspectives for me. I remember one man who told me, I finished, I don't know, some, not university, but a higher level of education. And he said, my father earned his money by carrying water, and the only chances I have with my education is continue his business. I don't want that. So what I think is, and when then I hear, especially in the Austrian debate, the German debate is a bit more, well, let's say intellectual. They are looking more into the depth of the problem, whereas in Austria politicians say, we will use development aid, which is minute, to, I don't know, to have them regularize their emigration, which is ridiculous because we know that remittances in those countries are much, much higher than development aid. So what I'm trying to say is, maybe to the two ministers that are already difficult to deal with, we need a third minister in the debate, which is the Minister for International Trade or Economic Development. Because what these countries need is not aid, is not humanitarian support. What they need is, as you said, international terms of trade that work in their favor. We need, as long as we have such a lopsided global distribution of wealth, people will come, of course they will come. So, and we also know that the global north benefit from these people because they get highly or quite qualified people whom they pay wages like blue-collar workers. So what I think is what is missing in the debate is the real root cause, which is terms of trade, which is global wealth distribution, and which is economic development, not in the way that we give you aid, but that we have fair economic relations. And I think this is, in fact, the most obvious solution, but no one discusses it.
It's funny. It very quickly becomes, in American English we would say a hot potato. I remember Angela Merkel, like as an integrated strategy for partnership with Africa. And I remember she was like, partnership with Africa, and I was like, well, it's a whole continent. What might go on? You're already treading on a tough regional issue. And then she said, we're gonna have a Marshall Fund for Africa. And I remember everyone was just like, your heart's in the right place, but your phrasing and your conceptualization of the relationship is still very based in this paternalistic, like we're going to provide you with the means. And it really struck me the degree to which, I guess I'll go back to the history again, the degree to which, not overtly but covertly, the historical relationship so fully consumes not just the operational relationship, but the language that gets used. And then reflexively how the language feeds back into, you know, how do we do this? How do we engage this way without navel gazing, like getting stuck in a rhetorical loop, but being able to say something like, we're going to have a Marshall Fund for Africa, and everyone goes, the framing is very paternalistic. What do you mean? Like, what is your goal? Do you actually want Habeck, like Minister Habeck, Schulze from the Development Cooperation Ministry, and I forget the name of the Interior Minister all of a sudden, like, should they be not doing trips on their own, but should they be traveling as a triumvirate, carrying a unified policy? Certainly, I think in the German system of government, that becomes a challenge. I was talking with someone about the national security strategy, and everyone was like, yes, we need integrated discussions about where development fits into defense and fits into trade and fits into, you know, how do we internationalize the concept of family, you know, the family and culture ministry. How do we actually take the best of what we do and export it as a package? And I said, okay, that's great. What's the coordination mechanism at the federal level for that? Like, is there a National Security Council? And you could just see like everyone's faces kind of sadden because they were like, nope, actually constitutionally, it would be very hard to put all that federal power under an executive. I remember thinking, there are layers of challenges for doing this that have multiple kind of root causes. And how you reflect on that simultaneously, I think, is a big one. So I would say on both sides, there's a long way to go in thinking about how you balance that and how you coordinate it. I don't have a solution, at least in the German context, other than a new constitution. But no, I fully agree.
I have two questions. First of all, the case of Malaysia that you elaborated on. Do you maybe could further elaborate why they were like more hostile towards the refugees from Rohingya, where and they guaranteed like resident status to Syrian refugees? Why? What was the difference? And my second question would be again the case of Colombia. Would you say that in terms of the public attitude, that since they have been dealing with a lot of refugees, they have this history that the public attitude there is much more refugee friendly compared to other societies, for example, like maybe here in Europe where there's a lot of animosity and people are really afraid when refugees are coming or when there's a crisis?
I think that's a really good point about kind of how the history of an experience shapes a public's perception. And I remember actually when we went into the project where most of this work comes from, it's called the Contested Mobility Project. I think all of us, the whole team that I work with, we came in definitely thinking like count, measure, technical solutions, and then we started seeing things like Colombians as a public body, as a body politic, have a very particular kind of socio-political relationship to internal displacement as something that is a component of, well, it's a tragedy for the country, but it's also something that the country in its response has become renowned for in terms of its progressiveness and its openness. Now, what's interesting is with the Venezuelan kind of discussion, you did see this kind of dual. There are two dynamics in play where Colombians in surveys done by the National Statistics Agency would say, yeah, reciprocity is important, and yes, historically, Venezuela has not only been a place that hosted displaced people, it's been a key labor migration partner. It was a Colombian colleague who said Cartagena was built with remittances from the oil industry, and this was a key place where Colombians went to work and they were welcome there. It was interesting to see the degree to which you can take that kind of history of good faith and how far you can push that until material resources really become a question for voters. And it was interesting to see that in polls, majorities would say, yes, they were sympathetic to Venezuelans. And if you switch the questions out to, should we be doing the TPS? Nope. And the degree to which the no's went up was strongly correlated with how close you got to the border. And when you look at the economics, the economic geography of the regions along the border, same thing. You could say, well, these are also poor regions who themselves struggle with material issues. And I thought it was interesting to kind of see, you don't end up with class solidarity between the Colombians and Venezuelans. The class solidarity stops at my understanding of the history versus my understanding of my material needs and what I'm hearing from the government too. And to a degree, I wonder if there was a signaling failure on the part of the government. While they were so good at dealing with the outside world, there really wasn't much discussion or much domestic pitch around this, except to say it's going to be chaos if we just have a bunch of people living in a gray area. In Colombia, I think the line is much clearer in Colombia. Malaysia. The line is much clearer in Malaysia. The government has always had a very sovereignty-oriented approach to how it deals with internal matters and borders. Again, when we go back through the history, so I have a book manuscript that hopefully will be done soon, or out soon, and I never knew about the role of the British in kind of anti-communist counterinsurgency fighting in the 60s in Malaysia, and the degree to which that also shaped kind of public perceptions of ethnic Chinese. So even if you get away from the refugee question, just the internal dynamics between different ethnic groups have these kind of historical arcs that are difficult. And the government, I think to a degree, is very careful to try to prevent that from blowing up. I think if you look at how Singapore as well kind of deals with being a multicultural country, and it's just like, you're all going to be nice, and that's that. You see that a lot in Malaysia as well. And I think when you start talking about refugees, when the Malaysian government sees that public sentiment is not in favor of one group, they're going to say, our responsibility is to our domestic sovereign audience. And even if we can't take all 60,000 Rohingya refugees and send them back to Bangladesh, which would probably be the direction you'd send them, we can certainly send a signal to the public that we see and hear that there is stress being felt, and we'll use the tools of the state to demonstrate that we hear you, if not actually deal with the root cause of the problem. I think in Malaysia that's a much clearer, there's very little debate about kind of the role of the government in that case. And the population and the government are a lot more simpatico about how they feel about the topic and how they signal each other.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions, comments?
Thank you very much, Professor. Very interesting lecture, and also it was super nice that you finished the whole presentation on positive notes. I would love to hear more practical examples of those action plan to be working, because like sadly, personally, I feel that it's in practice, those action plans for me, I have a hard time like seeing that they can work, you know, on a bigger scale. If I'm not mistaken, the first one it was like being engaged with politicians. It's based on my experience and whatever is happening in the North Globe since like 2015, 16. I think there's a heavy tendency and a fast tempo towards populism and anti-refugee movements and anti-refugee policies, and also it's that despite the fact that public has been like vocal in so many occasions, but still you feel that politicians less and less are taken accountable for the actions, and it seems like it's kind of fading away from the whole page, and also with development actors and refugee policies to be parallel and working towards the same objective, are also having a hard time seeing that practically working, because it seems like it's too many actors with different agendas. That actually often those agendas and objectives stand opposite each other, against each other, and not really in the same direction. So again, like it was not gesture, but like practically, it's really difficult to see that light at the end of the tunnel, like when it comes to relationship between like North and South on these ones.
Yeah, I guess I could offer a few practical ideas that obviously, yes, they run into rocks when you try to put them into practice. But often they're ideas that I almost never hear people talk about. From an American perspective, I remember a friend of mine was a consular officer in Juarez, and she said, our backlog of visas, like the backlog of people I have to do interviews with, is going to last 5 people after this post, like 10 years. And it was interesting because I said, well, you know, would it make a difference if the U.S. State Department just reallocated, say, $20 million in resources to the consular posts at the main crossings? And the fact that she was just like, no, that's insane. Like, that won't work. And I was like, I mean, that's not even lacking moral imagination. That's just a practical, if you have too many cases to adjudicate, maybe you need more consular officers. And I think to a degree sometimes when I deal with policy people, it's a bit of a problem of sometimes smart people talk themselves out of the easy solution. This was another, talking with someone actually at the German ministry, he was like, how can we deal with this, you know, if 2015 happens again, how do we deal with it? And I was like, we just deal with it. Like, it's not magic, you've done it before. Hungary in 1956, like, this has been done, and it's been done in a way that certainly, like, there were stresses and it was hard, but it was done. And the resources, I often think we tend to underestimate the resources available. You know, $20 million for the U.S. State Department is certainly, it's not zero, but for a $20 billion agency, like, yes, you could actually probably solve some of the backlog problems. And I think just being able to point that out, especially to a public audience, because I think also voters, public audiences, kind of go, oh, it's too complex. Like, if the experts are talking about how complex it is, it's too complex. And I think sometimes finding a way to convey the easy solution that gets the public and the experts and the bureaucrats in play to all go, actually, we don't have to make it this hard for ourselves. And maybe sometimes doing the right thing actually isn't the hardest thing to do. I think is the direction we have to go. Certainly hard things to navigate, but so there are solutions. And I think how we communicate that is a big component in navigating the rocky components of it.
Any more questions? Comments? Maybe I can ask a question. when we briefly talked about that before, and I also mentioned it in my introduction, because we have two, I think, very big, supposedly paradigm changes happening when it comes to refugee policy. I'm a bit skeptical whether it really is a paradigm shift. I'm talking on the one hand about the German proposal that was being discussed in the last couple of days. Now we're sort of externalizing asylum procedures. Well, at least not beyond European territory, but sort of to the borders, and to have these fast-track border asylum procedures, which is also, of course, already a form of externalization to the EU member states with sort of an outer border. And the other case that I mentioned is Title 42 ends today, so that will mean a change on the US-Mexican border. We do not know what kind of change exactly, and sort of expectations range from a surge in arrivals to, you know, really this will not make that much of a difference, because also currently, you might be aware of that, the US has I wouldn't say created a system, but put a system in place where you have to apply for a spot in the asylum offices via an app. So you have to log a request for getting an asylum application through an app, and you have to do that from outside the US. And then this app, because you also talked about digital solutions, that bring in new kinds of problems. And I feel like this app in particular has a lot of problems that come with it. So perhaps could you, and I know these are two very big questions, but maybe very briefly, apply this framework that you just presented to us as a lens to these new and very current policy challenges that we're seeing right now. So what would sort of, especially these three bullet points you mentioned at the end, you know, engage with politics and so on, and make sure that we're on equal footing. What would this mean for these two current shifts that we are seeing, so the German EU case and US-Mexican border, and solutions and everything? So sorry if it's a very broad question at the end, but
I think in the Title 42 case on the Mexican border, I think presenting a threat sells newspapers. I would hazard to guess that there might be an uptick in movement across the border, but I don't think, it's not going to be caravans, that old trope that was used by Trump in 2018. I think in part because Title 42 was put in place after people were already there. Like, how do you engage with the politics of that? Delete Texas and start over. It's a very difficult state to deal with. This kind of gets at what you mentioned. How do you get there? I think some of it is, again, going back to kind of being able to use historical narratives to shape present debates. We were talking earlier about Mexican border and how it's perceived. I have a colleague at the University of Denver in the US whose parents are El Salvadorian. They came to California illegally. He was born in the US and became a citizen from birth. But we were talking about the border, and he said, for Mexicans in Texas and California, less to a degree in Arizona and New Mexico, but Texas and California, the border is very fluid. It's something that people have moved back and forth across. For Central Americans, it is a deeply traumatizing space. The experience is completely different. It's very dangerous. So I think to a degree, kind of when you talk about Title 42, some of it might be how do you get the Washington Post not to lead with National Guard going to border to physically prevent people from crossing, and lead with, for 100 years, this has been a space of movement that actually has very strong cultural narratives in Texas politics.
and labor force supply.
And labor force supply. How do you engage the pride that American Texans of Mexican descent feel in the connection to the border particularly? I think the border plays a really interesting role in how we think about this, not just all of Mexico, but the border itself. So how do you get editors to buy into that without being kind of soft focus? Like, this isn't just talking about history in a soft focus, nice way. Like, this is a real thing that's really worked. And I think it engages people at an emotional level. Certainly hearing my colleague talk about his parents, that was very kind of connective in thinking about the border, how you scale that up. I think that's certainly easier than hiring 10,000 new diplomats, is using media to shape that narrative. So that could be one way, especially with Title 42. I know less about the German policy. I haven't actually been able to keep up with it the last few days. So
you avoid engaging in German politics at this point. Yeah, good. I get it. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Charles. Unless there are any further questions, I would like to again thank you so much for this really, really exciting talk. So many issues that you raised. I think this will become only more relevant in the months and years to come, unfortunately, we have to say. Thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you all for coming, for engaging, and for discussing. And as Vedran said, we hope this is just the beginning of a, lecture series, perhaps. More and more events on, I hope, also refugee policy, which is, of course, a crucial point of international affairs. So again, thank you all for coming, and have a good rest of the day.